Okay, well, first, uh, welcome. We're so tickled that we can do this. The wonderful thing about a college and a public library are the kinds of things that we can do together. Our visit with the greater Pulaski community and with our own students is sponsored really by the Reverend Dr. Michael Williams Storytelling Across the Curriculum program. So we haven't publicly announced that yet. And I don't know if you grew up around here or you were like me. I grew up with Margaret Perry Williams, who is Michael's widow. And Michael Williams, when we were all young couples, Michael Williams was my Sunday school teacher in Columbia, and we've known each other. Michael and I had known each other since we were about 18. He is a legend among all Methodists and people of all faiths. He was a wonderful storyteller, internationally renowned. He was a preacher and he was a writer and he was a counselor and a dramatist. I mean, he was an amazing human being. And as I say, we were old friends. So when I came to Martin in 2015, Michael said, well, you know what? I want to retire. Can I come down there with you? And I thought, oh my goodness, how much fun would that be? Well, in the meantime, Dr. Mark LaBranch came as our new president. And so Dr. LaBranch and Michael hit it off immediately. And we were all so, so pleased. And he came to our campus in the fall of 2017. And he worked with our nurses, the kinds of things that Michael did with the nursing students, trying to help patients, especially Alzheimer's patients and patients with beginning dementia, to help our nursing students learn how to capture the stories of those patients, to work with the family in different kinds of units. Michael made such a difference. And then in March of 2018, he died uh, in the night. It was the saddest thing in the world. And ever since then, we've been thinking, oh my goodness, we've got to honor his legacy. And Margaret, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I am saying or not, but if you do, you just jump in there, just unmute yourself and say anything you want to. Michael always felt that human beings can connect when they tell each other stories, when they listen to each other's stories, and that's a way to make sense of the world and the people who inhabit it. So you will hear a whole lot about uh, storytelling across the curriculum at Martin Methodist within the next few months. But we wanted to kick off our celebration early in the fall with Homer Hickam. We thought he would be perfect. He and Dr. LaBranch connected about a year ago, and we just thought that Homer would be so good for us as a community to hear because he's such an inspirational speaker. Um, you probably know about him because he wrote the bestseller Rocket Boys, which was, on the New York Times bestseller list. And that was made into a movie, October Sky, which we've all seen multiple times. I bet I've seen that movie 10 times and I still love it. He is the perfect Renaissance man. Aristotle said that the perfect Renaissance man was part poet, part athlete. And I would say that Homer is part poet, part space engineer, and Michael was part poet and part storyteller. So that would be wonderful. Homer Hickam was an Army officer. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War. These days, he is a paleontologist. He's been a coal miner and he's been a scuba instructor. He's been a NASA engineer. He's done it all and he's still doing it. So, the way we're going to structure our discussion tonight is we are going to ask Homer to talk to us. And as you have questions, put those in the chat box, and Cindy or I, one, will get your questions to Homer. And we're going to start with Homer, and then we'll take times for questions. So without further ado, it is just really our wonderful pleasure to welcome Homer Hickam to Giles County.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Judy. And I just want to say that I've had a great day already, and this is just icing on the cake. And being up at Martin Methodist and meeting Dr. LeBranch again, and you and Cindy and your wonderful instructors there, and the students were just marvelous. I love talking to them, and in some cases, I even got a few of them to laugh, which is kind of, I think they were laughing behind their masks. And so that went really, really well, I thought. And we talked a little bit about storytelling, and specifically about the book that I'm best known for, Rocket Boys, that they made the movie October Sky. And I always like to have the joke with the young ladies in the audience, to start off with, by apologizing for not actually being Jake Gyllenhaal. And so that's good. It's really great that that a lot of them, most of them, has seen the movie. As I think is true, almost every substitute teacher in the world has shown October Sky. So then over the period of time, these students may see it, like 3 or 4 times during their secondary school and high school. But anyway, we had a good connection today, and talking about that book and some of the other books as well. What I like talking to them about was first thing, of course, is that Pulaski is out in the country, the way Colwood was, where I grew up, and I suspect that the people there are a lot like the people that I grew up with, in that there are some pretty good storytellers out there. And I grew up with those storytellers, and pretty soon you could tell which ones were the good ones and which ones were the not so good ones, because the ones that were not so good, when they launched into their story, you kind of try to ease on away from them, because they were never going to get to the punchline. I'll try to get to some punchlines tonight. But storytellers, true storytellers, but there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and you've got to do it fairly quickly, with just telling with a audible type of story. But books, you got a little bit longer, but it really does have a beginning, a middle, and end, which makes it a little bit harder when you're writing a memoir, because a memoir is basically what really happened. But memoirs are structured like novels. They're not autobiographies. They're written like any kind of novel, fiction novel, yet they are entirely based on the truth. So that's one of the real challenges to an author who is going to write a memoir. And for Rocket Boys, I have to say that Rocket Boys has been very, very successful. It was #1 on a bunch of bestseller lists. It's been translated into, 18 or so different languages. It's sold millions and millions of copies. And it's still in hardcover, which is amazing. It came out in 1998, and it's still in hardcover. That's just unknown. But so many people wanted the hardcover and not the paperback, that Random House actually has kept it. And they took it off for a little while and then came back within like 6 months. That's called a first plus. And so again, that's just not known. But for writing Rocket Boys, the way that came about was that I was writing short pieces. I had already published a book called Torpedo Junction, Military History, did pretty well. But I was really busy at NASA, and I was writing short stories or short articles for other magazines. And one night in December of '96, I got a call from Pat Trenner, who was the editor of Smithsonian Air and Space magazine, who asked me if I could write 2,000 words overnight. She was desperate for a filler, and she said, "You got the reputation around here for being a fast writer, Homer." She didn't say good writer, she said fast writer. So I looked across on my desk and I saw there an artifact from when I was a kid in the coal camps of West Virginia, Coalwood, and I built rockets. And I said, Pat, I could write you 2,000 words on when I was a boy growing up in this coal camp in West Virginia, and I built rockets. And she was completely, totally, utterly underwhelmed with this idea. So I did it anyway. And I am a fast writer. And so I produced 2,000 words overnight. Next thing I knew, I was hearing from New York publishers when it came out that, it was very, people just loved this little story, and New York publishers started to call, and then even Hollywood started to call just based on that article. So they asked me, are you going to write a book about this? And I said, well, I am now. So that's what started me to write it. Now, I started writing it at that time. I was very active at NASA, and I thought the way to write this book was as a NASA engineer, successful, looking back on his past and bouncing back and forth between my present career at that time and growing up in Coalwood and building these rockets. And I wrote over 200 pages, and it just didn't work. I didn't like it. So I threw it all away and started all over again. And so to write this book, I knew, unfortunately, I had to get into the head of this boy. I had to go back to this 14-year-old boy in 1957 and get into his head and write it as he would have written it. And I like to say I got $1 million worth of psychotherapy doing that I didn't even know I needed. So I went back and did that, and that's why I think this book works for teenagers, especially, and high school kids really can't identify with this character, even though it's somebody who was growing up in the late 1950s. That's that boy telling the story with all of his problems with his parents and with girlfriends and his friends and everything else. And I think that's why this book works. And it's also, of course, in a unique place, Coalwood, West Virginia at that time was a pure company town. The company owned everything, every house, every tree, every fence. To live in Coalwood, you had the adult male in the house, which all the houses were owned by the company, had to work for the coal company. All adult females had to be either married to a coal miner or a school teacher. They let school teachers, single school teachers live there, but it was a very, very controlled town. So it was a unique time and place. And I always like to tell people that the company owned the church, which it did, which meant, and since they kept a preacher for some reason on a 3-year contract, every 3 years we got a brand new religion. So we like to say we got the low bid religion, whatever it was. And so sometimes we'd be just trucking right along real happy as Methodists, and overnight we'd become Southern Baptists. And it was like, that's, hymn lines had to go down on the women's dresses. Saturday night dances were canceled. And so, but then 3 years, we usually got the Methodists back. So that was good. But it was an interesting time and an interesting place to grow up. And in 1957, as I wrote in Rocket Boys, the Russians, who were our big enemy, launched Sputnik and scared everybody to death, except for the kids. We loved the idea that something was going into space. We were all big readers, we're science fiction readers, and all of a sudden there was something going on in space. And I personally wanted to be part of that. And what happened was I told my mom I was going to go watch Sputnik fly over when I read in the paper that it was going to fly over. And she told everybody, the fence line, one neighbor lady to the other. And I think the message got muddled. And before we knew it, about half the town was in our backyard because they thought that was the only place they could see it. But Sputnik came over. I was very, very impressed by it. It was just amazing. And the next night at the supper table, I told my parents and my older brother, the football star, that I was going to build a rocket. And Mom took a long look at me, and she said, well, don't blow yourself up. And if you don't mind, I will read this part of the book that tells about what happened next. I appointed myself chief rocket designer. Odell, who was the garbage man's son, provided me with a small discarded plastic flashlight to use as the body of the rocket. I emptied its batteries and then punched a hole in its base with a nail. I cracked open my cherry bombs left over from the 4th of July and poured the powder from them into the flashlight and then wrapped it all up in electrical tape. You can kind of tell where this is going. So I took one of the cherry bomb fuses and stuck it in a hole and then glued the entire apparatus inside the fuselage of a D-wing plastic model airplane. Since Sherman, who had polio, couldn't run very fast, and also because it was his idea, he was placed in charge of the countdown, a position that allowed him to stand back. Roy Lee was to bring the matches. Odell was to strike the match and hand it to me. I would like to fuse and make a run for it. Everybody had something to do. When night came, we balanced our rocket looking wicked and sleek on top of my mother's rose garden fence. The fence was a source of some pride and satisfaction to her. It had taken 6 months of her reminding her husband, my dad, before he finally sent the company carpenter down from the mine to build it. The night was cold and clear, all the better, we thought, for us to track our rocket as it streaked across the dark and starry sky. We waited until some coal cars rumbled past, and then I lit the fuse and ran back to the grass at the edge of the rose bushes. Odell smacked his hand over his mouth to smother his excited giggles. Sparkles of fire dribbled out of the fuse. Sherman was counting backward from 10. We waited expectantly, and then Sherman reached 0 and yelled, "Blast off," just as the cherry bomb powder detonated. There was an eyewitness, a miner waiting for a ride at the gas station across the street. For the edification of the fence gossipers, he would later describe what he had seen. There was, he reported, a huge flash in the Hickham's yard and a sound like God himself had clapped his hands. Then an arc of fire lifted up and up into the darkness, turning and cartwheeling and spewing bright sparks. The way the man told it, our rocket was a beautiful and glorious sight. And I guess he was right as far as it went. The only problem was it wasn't our rocket that streaked into that dark, cold, clear, and starry night. It was my mother's rose garden fence. So that scene sets the tone of the book in a lot of ways. It really, really sets up the whole rest of the book. Obviously, these boys don't know what they're doing. We know that they've done something really wrong, because this was a fence that Sonny, as I was called, Sonny's mother, took a long time to get built around these beautiful rose bushes that she had. And all of a sudden, rather than them launch their rocket like they thought, they blew away her fence. And then the next scene is also keen, where the whole town, every porch light comes on, and every dog up and down the valley. It was like Colwood thought that the Russians had finally attacked, and they'd chosen Colwood as their first target. And Mom and Dad come out on the porch, and my dad, Homer, takes one look. I'm a junior, so his name was Homer. Took one look and said, "You handle it, Elsie." And then she comes out in the yard. So after that scene, what happens next, again, is key in that she, rather than kill him, as would have been appropriate probably, she challenges him to learn how to build a rocket, to really learn how to build a rocket, because even though his dad doesn't think he's of much use, and would probably be better just to go work in the coal mine, she thinks he should go to college. And so she challenges him that night to build a rocket, to prove to his father that he can do it. With that next 3 years, I have to cover 3 years in this novel. We see the boys start to mature in a lot of ways. We see them learn. We see them, probably more important, bringing the whole town in to help them, and also their high school chemistry teacher and physics teacher, Miss Riley, a young woman who had Hodgkin's disease, was dying, and she knew it, but wanted to make her boys heroes in a school that was a hero is defined as being a good football player. And so that set up all kinds of tension between the boys, the rest of the high school, their potential girlfriends or lack of same. And also we see the tensions between the Sonny, as I always call it, Sonny's parents also going on as Elsie pushes them forward, and the father is not just very uncertain about this whole thing because the town that he loves, Colwood, is starting to die. So we see all those things that come together, or really they only come together at the end, and but there causes all these different threads that go through the novel, tighten and tighten and tighten. They start to, rather than being singular threads, start to wrap themselves around each other until the very, very last. And that scene is where the boys decide to launch the last rocket after the National Science Fair. Against all odds, they've gone off and won a gold medal in the National Science Fair. Makes Miss Riley happy. She's got something she can put in a trophy case besides football and sports trophies. So we see that happen. We see a lot of pride in the town, but not from the father. And that's the thread that remains. That's what the final thread that doesn't get wrapped around until the last scene. And that last scene is one that I saved for myself when I wrote this book. I refused to write this scene until I got there. I didn't want to jump ahead, even though I knew where I was headed with this memoir. I did not want to jump ahead to write this scene. And so let me, it's not a very long scene. And so let me read that for you, if I can find it here. All right. Okay. So this is the last scene. Oct 31 was our last and biggest rocket. We named our rockets after a bird that couldn't fly. We had a sense of humor about that. 6.5 feet long, 2¼ inches in diameter. We carefully raised it into a vertical position and then lowered it on the launch rod. Sonny Royley said, "Do you see who's here?" And I looked up from my work. Who? Just look. The town constable opened a path through the crowd, and there stood my father in his work clothes. Now, my dad had never come to see any of our rocket launches where most of the whole town turned out for every one of them. So Royley went after him, escorted him out in the slack. Slack is old coal that's thrown away. That's why we had such a good rocket launch area, because slack kills everything, and they had clear cut the mountains at that time. So we had this big range that we called Cape Colwood. I heard Royley say, "Come and help us, Mr. Hickam." "Oh, you don't need my help," Dad said. "I just came to watch." All the boys protested. "No, sir, you can help all you want. Whatever you want to do, sir, you go ahead and do it." I stood up, brushing the slack off my jeans. "A rocket won't fly unless somebody lights the fuse," I said. "Come on, Dad, this one's yours if you want it." I was surprised. There was no mistaking the pure delight I saw spread across his face as he knelt in front of the firing panel. I counted down to 0, and Dad turned the switch. Oct 31 erupted, blowing huge chunks of concrete loose from the pad. The crowd took a step backward, and some of them started to run. Oct 31 split the air that filled the narrow valley, a shockwave rippling across the slack. Women screamed, and men clapped their hands to their ears. The thunderous din didn't stop. Oct 31 kept pounding us as it climbed. The men, women, and children all watched it with mouths agape, eyes wide, their cheers stuck in their throats. At the company store, those few old men not at the launch got uncertainly to their feet as the thunder reached them. They stumbled into the road, shading their eyes, the trunk of fire and smoke tearing out of the mountain like God's finger stuck suddenly toward the sky. In his church, the preacher raced to the belfry and began to toll the bell in celebration. Royley kept his eye on his watch. 38, 39, 40. "Still see it," Billy announced. The great spout of smoke turned into a dim yellowish streak, just about gone. 43, 44. "Gone," Billy announced. "Gone at 44 seconds. I did a quick calculation. Assuming he was flying nearly vertical, Oct 31 had disappeared at an altitude of 31,000 feet, nearly 6 miles high. I became aware of movement beside me, and I was astonished to see Dad dancing on the slack, waving his old hat in his hand. He was exulting to the sky. "Beautiful, beautiful." So as Op 31 raced across the sunlit sky on that glorious day, I did not watch the rocket. I instead watched my dad and waited patiently and with hope for him to put his arm around my shoulder and tell me at last that I had done something good. There, I heard Billy yell, there it is. People surged from the road across the slack, following the other boys as they raced after our last great rocket. Dad stopped his dance and he put his hat over his heart. And he bent over as if a great weight had suddenly been dropped on his back. And he looked at me, his mouth open, and I saw in his eyes a curious mixture of happiness and pain that dissolved into fear. I went to him and put my arm around his shoulder, supporting him while he fought for air against the black lung that would kill him all too soon. You did really good, Dad, I told him as a spasm of deep oily coughs racked his body. Nobody ever launched a better rocket than you. So you got to have a good beginning and you got to have a good end to your books. And with memoirs, it's a kind of a good thing that you led your life that way. And this was a true story. And it came to me in this surprising way to write it, and it has gone on. It essentially made my career and has allowed me now to go write 17, I think, more books, and I'm working for 19. It's based on after Rocket. I went back to the memoir. I've written a lot of fiction and nonfiction, but I decided to write, since so many people have asked me about my life after Rocket Boys. This is about, but there's a lot to write about. So it's going to college, Virginia Tech, and then off to Vietnam, and then later, being a scuba instructor and writing Torpedo Junction, and then all the NASA years and so on. There's a lot, and so how to craft that is pretty interesting. And I get to have another $1 million worth of psychotherapy as I write that and remembering all of this stuff. So it's a pleasure to be an author. And as mentioned, I've got some sidelines. I love paleontology now. I wrote a book called The Dinosaur Hunter, which was based on my many months out in Montana. I've actually been going out there for the last 20 years or so, every summer, and looking for dinosaur bones. And we've been pretty successful about it. We found, I think we've gotten credit now for actually 6 T-Rexes out of the 40 some ever found. My little team, 2 or 3 guys out there, and so we're pretty happy about it. And it's a great place to go. And your cell phones don't work, nothing works out there, so it's just really a good place to go out. Even if you don't find anything, it's a beautiful area to be.
Homer?
Yes.
So you have a question, you have a couple of questions.
Okay.
One is from a 9-year-old, and what she wants to know, said she's seen your movie, October Sky, many times. And she wants to know if you have ever been into space, or if you haven't, do you want to go into space?
Well, no, I haven't been into space yet. I flew the Concorde a couple of times, which is good. And that meant I went at Mach 2 or so, but no, that was not where my career took me. I wanted to actually, back during the Rocket Boys day, I wanted to learn how to build a rocket, not fly on top of one of them. And then I got to spend a good part of my career training astronauts, which was, so I had to do a lot of things that they do, fly on the old, what they called the Vomit Comet, the up and down airplane, to get into weightless conditions. I went underwater wearing the spacesuit a bunch of times to figure out the procedures to repair the Hubble Space Telescope. Would I go? Yes, I would go. And I'm ready. Anytime somebody wants to offer me a seat, I'll climb in it and go. No problem.
And then your fellow Virginia Tech Hokie says Virginia Tech Engineering in the house. That's Kathy Roberts. She's class of '83. Go Hokies. And then Marcia is thanking you for your service. And then Jackie Bellamy has a question about, and it's advice for aspiring children's book writer. I want to ask you something. So, Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre in 6 weeks. She had the idea, but really she had to take care of her father. He had eye surgery, and she wrote Jane Eyre in 6 weeks. Louise May Alcott wrote Little Women in 6 weeks. She had a story to tell. How long did it take you to write Rocket Boys? And then what advice would you give to Jackie about writing a book for children?
Well, Rocket Boys, again, I started and I probably wasted almost a year writing the wrong thing before I pitched it out. So I would say probably about a year and a half it took to write the Rocket Boys that got published. In terms of writing a children's novel, of course, Rocket Boys is not a children's novel. It is an adult novel. I've heard of parents buying Rocket Boys for their 9-year-old, and I go, you know what? You really ought to read ahead, because there's stuff in this book. It's just not meant for young kids. It really is an adult novel. It has some very, very adult themes. But in terms of one of the hardest genres to write is children's novels or children books. It's very, very specific about what will be in those books. Publishers look for specific things. I would say the best way to learn how to write, or to write for any genre, it doesn't really matter which genre it is to read a lot from that genre. If you're going to, for instance, write a romance novel, you better read a whole bunch of romance novels before you even try, because there are certain things about the way the flow of those novels, how they start, what is expected by romance novel readers, and the ending all have to kind of really fit a certain pattern. That is a very tough, the romance novel is a very tough genre to work. I only wrote one just to see if I could. Don't know I was entirely successful. I gave it an awful name. Red Helmet is the name of it. It should have been called The Coal Miner's Wife. I figured that out about 2 years after it was published, but but it did all right. But nonetheless, that's a very tough genre to work in.
Homer, Kathy Roberts wants you to tell everybody about building and firing Skipper at the football game when you were at Virginia Tech.
I can tell about that because I just wrote about it with this new memoir. I just covered that area. Very quickly, Virginia Tech, when I went there, was mostly a military college, and it was called VPI. And our big rivals was a school called VMI, which is still around, and Virginia Military Institute. And every Thanksgiving, we would go and have a big football game on Thanksgiving where the VPI played VMI, and the two cadet corps would march in, and then get on opposite sides of the field and start chanting at each other. And like our chant was, "We're going home," because we were allowed to go home after Thanksgiving. The VMI guys had to go back to their campus. They weren't allowed to go home. So that was one of them. But another chant was, they had a little, a small, tiny little cannon that was called Little John, and they would drag that out and they would fire it. And then they would chant, "Where's your cannon? Where's your cannon?" So a few guys at the Cadet Corps VPI got it in our head, we were going to build a cannon. Not only, we weren't going to buy a cannon, we were going to build one. And so over a period of time, and it was sort of like the Rocket Boy story, it was against the wishes of the school administration, we sneaked around and built this gigantic brass cannon. And we brought it in at the next VPI VMI game. And we kind of sneaked it in and set it up on the sidelines, and the VMI cadets brought out their little cannon and they fired it and said, "Where's your cannon? Where's your cannon?" And I put a triple charge in our cannon, and that was probably the biggest charge it ever had. And it reared back about, it was about an 800-pound cannon. It reared back about an inch off the ground. It sent a shockwave across the football field, knocked all the hats off the VMI cadets, and cracked the glass on the other side of the press box. And then we chanted, "Here's our cannon." so, so it was worth it. And so the skipper became a big tradition at Virginia Tech, and went on for about 30 years. Now that it's retired, that it was a brass cannon. It wore out after a while. It's retired, and they've got Skipper 2 now. So that's the story of Skipper.
That's a great story.
It's even true, which just makes it nicer.
And can you tell us about Albert the alligator?
Oh yeah, okay. Well, the most recent book is a book called Carrying Albert Home, and both my parents grew up in McDowell County, where Coalwood was. They were in a little town called Gary, but that's where they grew up. And my dad asked Elsie, her name was Elsie Lavender, to marry him, and she said, "No way, I'm going to Florida and live with my rich Uncle Aubrey." Well, I've seen pictures of rich Uncle Aubrey. He's like got this little trailer with a dead palm tree behind it, but he was down in Orlando. So this was in like 1930 or so. She went down there and lived with rich Uncle Aubrey and met this young man that his parents owned a dance studio, and his name was Buddy Ebsen. And Buddy Ebsen later became Uncle Jed and the Beverly Hillbillies. But anyway, they sparked, and Mom thought that Buddy was going to marry her, but he went off to New York, where he went first, and then he never came back. And so she came back to West Virginia and married my dad. And so Buddy heard about it, and I don't think he liked that very much. And he sent her as a wedding gift a baby alligator. You could do that back then. You could you could buy alligators and put it in a shoebox and mail it. So that's what happened. There was this little alligator, and to remind Elsie of their time in Florida. And so my dad was very jealous of that alligator, and so she raised it in the bathtub in the company house there until it got so big it chased the dad down the steps. He wasn't my dad then. It was many years later that my brother and I were born. But anyway, he yelled back and said, "All right, Elsie, it's either me or this alligator." And after a few days of thinking it over, she said, "Okay, I'll let Albert go, but we have to carry him home." And so Carrying Albert Home is the story of how my future parents, Homer and Elsie, carried Albert in a wash tub in the back seat of an old Buick from Coalwood to Florida. All kinds of adventures. They had a rooster that showed up for no apparent reason to go away for a few days and come back again. They met John Steinbeck as they went. Ernest Hemingway down in the Keys. They got caught in a hurricane. They met a ghost. They're just, and over the years, I heard all these stories. And my mom had a personalized copy of Sweet Thursday from John Steinbeck, so it might even be true. So that's why it's called The Somewhat True Story of a Man, His Wife, and Their Alligator. And I had a lot of fun writing that. And it probably is the most successful book after Rocket Boys.
Well, tell us this. Because we do have probably some aspiring writers in our audience, when you decided that you were actually going to write Rocket Boys and Albert the Alligator too, anything that has those biographical or autobiographical elements in there, did you tell your friends, the Rocket Boys, did you ask their permission? Did you let them read what you said about them? How did that work for you?
I decided early on not to ask them for a couple of reasons. Primarily was because if they told me a story about what happened and I didn't use it, I thought they wouldn't like that. And also, if their recollection didn't match mine, then I would have trouble writing any particular scene and so on, because somebody else had kind of interfered with my thoughts on that. So I decided not to tell them or to show them what I was writing, but I did tell them that I was writing it. That's all I told them. And they said, fine. They did it, if it got published, it'd sell 100 copies. They never expected that a movie would be made. And when I told them a movie was going to be made, they didn't believe that either. But they thought that was going to be fun. And if it happened, and then everything happened. And then, of course, their life changed a little bit all of a sudden because they got to be well known and where they weren't before. And some of them enjoyed it and some of them didn't. But that's the way I approached it.
Will you tell us about those boys? You know, they're so interesting in the movie. Would you kind of tell us about them in real life? Were they as poor? Were you all as poor as, I mean, y'all seem pretty poor, but the math genius, he seemed kind of poor and pitiful.
Yeah.
Was that true?
There were actually 6 boys rather than the 4 they showed in the movie. They combined a couple of the characters. Quentin and Billy were combined, and Odell and Sherman were combined. And Sherman had polio. That's why Odell in the movie sometimes remembers to limp, is he's supposed to have polio, which they never mentioned. So what really happened to the boys, we all went to college. We all graduated from college. We didn't get scholarships like the movie said. I went through on an Elsie Hickam scholarship. My mom paid my way through. She had the money. She saved up and could pay. And I worked in a coal mine during the summer. And Quentin did get a scholarship. I'll take that back. Quentin, the prototypical nerd of all time. We recruited him into our missile agency because we figured that if anybody knew how to build a rocket, it was Quentin. He said, yes, I know everything about rockets, but he didn't really, but he did know about black powder that the Chinese used, and that got us started. Quentin went to Marshall University and just showed up in classes. And it was like, you kind of missing a step here, Mr. Wilson. You need to apply to college and you need to pay us some money. And he said, well, I'm one of those boys down in McDowell County that won the gold medal for the National Science Fair. And lo and behold, they gave him a scholarship. That was pretty cool. And so Roy Lee, who was allowed to be a member of the Big Creek Missile Agent mainly because he had a car. And he was a funny guy. He told funny jokes. So Roy Lee went on to the University of Maryland, worked his way through. And I think he graduated in public affairs. I won't swear to that, but now he teaches how to be an entrepreneur to young people in West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. He does that because he ended up opening up a lot of businesses. Odell, the garbage man's son, he went to Colorado State, went in the Air Force, got a GI Bill, went to Colorado State in business administration, owned his own company in Virginia, and now is retired, lives on a great big farm that he has down there. Sherman died rather young because of his polio, but he opened one of the first software companies ever up in New Hampshire. And if polio hadn't taken the vestiges of polio hadn't taken him, he might have been, well, he was definitely before Bill Gates ever thought about it. So who knows what Sherman might have been. Billy went in the Air Force, also went to West Virginia University and graduated in mining engineering and became a rather well-known mining engineer. So we all had pretty successful lives, as it turned out. So,
tell us about Miss Riley, the physics.
Oh yeah, Miss Frida Riley she was only, I think, 5 years older than we were, and 5 or 6. She went to the same high school, Big Creek, and was a valedictorian there, and then went to Concord Teachers College and was a valedictorian there, and decided to come back and to teach at the high school. And she was a very inspirational teacher. She was this amazing teacher. She obviously just loved what she was doing. And her big thing in terms of the Rocket Boy story is that she wanted to make sure that these boys got recognition for it. And she was kind of fed up with the school being a big sports school. It had a huge trophy case, just packed full of trophies, mainly football, basketball, some and track, but it was just a big football school. And she felt like that there needed to be a trophy in there for the boys and girls who didn't do it. And so she hoped that we would be able to at least get a maybe third place in the county science fair, and she could put that ribbon in trophy case. In order to help us, we kept saying, or Quentin kept saying, we needed a book. And so Miss Riley, called Principles of Guided Missile Design. I later saw that book in a PhD program for rocket science. It required a working knowledge from the first page of calculus and differential equations. And I personally was having trouble with algebra at the time. But we were willing to learn. And so we basically self-taught ourselves calculus and differential equations so we could understand this book. And Miss Riley was obviously very, very proud of what happened. Her Hodgkin's disease was, which she came down with during the rocket era, was obviously, at that time was not survivable. It is now, but it wasn't then. So she knew that even though she loved teaching so much, that she only had a few years left. And to the extent that she, at the very last, was carried by stretcher to her classroom. That's how much she loved to teach. So she was, again, a very, very inspirational teacher, just a very good teacher. She didn't brook any nonsense. She was a tough teacher, no question about it. She was not our friend, but she really was. But in classroom, she wasn't our friend. She really held us to a higher standard, and just a lovely, lovely teacher. And I'm on the board at the Space and Rocket Center now. That's Space Camp and Space Academy. And it really, really pleases me so much when teachers come there during the summer. They take classes there. And they get credit for it. And so many of them tell me that Miss Riley to them is an icon. So that to me is, if there's anything important about writing this book and a movie and so on, is that it brought Miss Riley back to life.
You know, we're starting this storytelling across the curriculum program at the college. Do you have any, what suggestions would you give us at the college, not just at the college, but actually in Pulaski and Giles County, because, you know, storytelling is a community event. Do you have any suggestions for us about building a storytelling culture on campus in our public schools? So many, you said this to me before, Homer, when we talked the other day. So many people don't think that they have a story to tell. Michael Williams said everybody had a story to tell. Could you talk to us about suggestions? How do we get people to understand that, man, they've got plenty of stories to tell?
Yeah, what I like to say, Judy, is that we kind of lost the art of telling stories around the supper table. It used to be, again, my mom made a requirement of that we all, you know, Dad had to come back from the mine and sit there and we would all tell what we had done for the day. And then afterwards, they'd have their coffee. My parents, my brother would just leave. He wasn't interested, but I would listen to my folks start to reminisce and tell stories about when they were younger. And I was just fascinated by it, really. And that ultimately led, you know, to carrying Albert home. But also, I learned who they were as they went through the stories. I learned who they were. I learned who their parents were. I learned who their grandparents were. If they hadn't told those stories, I would not have known. There's just no way that I would have known about that. So what I recommend is that parents start that again any way they can. Because even though their kids may say that they're really not interested or act like they're not interested, you have to be, because that defines who you are. Your family defines who you are. And the only way for most young people to find out who they are to hear the stories that their parents tell. It can be very, very simple stories. How did you meet? You know, what was the circumstances? Was there anybody else, or and how did your parents meet? I mean, that's a very simple question. How did they meet? And that almost invariably leads to stories, and good stories that if you don't ask them, And you don't find out when your parents and grandparents are alive. You can't recover from that. They're gone, and you will never hear it. So my recommendation is through this storytelling process to remind everybody to tell their story to their kids.
We've got a bunch of questions. Can you see them, Cindy?
I can.
Okay, you want to ask?
Okay. Well, let me get back up here. From Milton, he says, when flying your rocket so high, did you ever think about inadvertently hitting something like a low-flying airplane?
Well, it was very rare for an airplane to fly over Colwood. If an airplane flew over Colwood, everybody stopped what they were doing and looked up and go, "Whoa, what is that?" It just didn't happen that much. So I didn't worry about that particularly. What I did worry about a little bit was the rocket going the wrong direction. And because they went so high. Now we were about 12 miles out of town, but a rocket that can go 5 or 6 miles high can also go horizontally a lot farther. And we did have that happen once where the rocket went exactly the wrong direction and landed back up in town. Fortunately, it didn't hit anybody, but it dug a pretty good hole.
Did you recover all the rockets that you launched?
Yes, we did. The movie came up with the idea that we lost one, which was a good idea. Again, movies have a different art. It's a different art form than writing a book. And I understand that the structure is different. And you've got to have certain tension, and you also want to have beautiful scenes. So you got to have a reason for the boys being out in the woods, so looking for their lost rocket. But no, we never lost one. Even the big ones, when they went up so high, you'd think you might, but they were very loud when they came. We didn't have parachutes. They just came in ballistically, making a lot of noise when they came in, because whistling down through the air. The last 12 or so broke the sound barrier within a half second of launch. So we're talking about a lot of noise. And so when they came down, they came down with a pretty big whistle like an artillery round, and they invariably hit a rock when they were a boulder or a cliff. It was just like, there's nothing around except dirt and trees, except right there where that big boulder is, and bam, it hit right on it. And that we were never able to reuse any of those rockets for that reason.
You have Marcia says that cannon that we were talking about,
The skipper, yeah.
That the cannon was the bane of her existence during her senior year of high school, that her physics teacher used the trajectory of Skipper 2's potential projectiles for examples. Isn't that interesting that she was a proud Hokie and a proud Hokie parent?
Yes, and I don't take any responsibility for the skipper messing up her educational career. You can blame maybe Newtonian physics for that.
Got another question. Have you kept in contact with your rocket buddies over the years?
I have. I didn't for a long time. Again, I was Vietnam in the 60s and all that mess. We all went our different directions, but Odell, very gregarious, and he kind of kept in touch with everybody, so he knew where everybody was. So when I started writing Rocket Boys, he was able to go out to everybody and say, "Hey, Sonny is being his usual idiotic self and thinks that he can publish a novel about us where absolutely nobody cares." So then I started talking to a few of them. That was in the mid 90s, and then once the book was published and the movie came out, Colwood started to having the October Sky Festival, and the boys came to that. And so we got back together. It was like we had never been apart, really. So our friendship was terrific. And then later, after a dozen years or so, it moved to Beckley, which is a bigger city in West Virginia, the Rocket Boys Festival, and they continued to come. Unfortunately, Quentin passed away last summer. Sherman had passed away many, many years earlier. But so we're getting long in tooth here, but we're still very much friends.
Jackie asks that she wants to know that what she knows what brought you here, but how did you end up deciding to stay in this area? And then she has come across several signed copies of your books at the libraries in Huntsville.
Well, I think I've signed every Rocket Boys that's ever been printed. Seems like, and there's millions of them. What brought me here originally was the Army. After I came back from Vietnam, I had a short break in service, and then was brought back into the Army and sent to Redstone Arsenal, and that would have been in 1969. So I went away several times. I lived in Germany for a few years. I lived in Japan for a little while. And then I lived in Puerto Rico for a while. But I always came back here. I love this area. It is absolutely gorgeous. People are really, really great. They remind me a lot of West Virginians and West Virginia. We're all kind of related. And of course, that's the joke in West Virginia. We're all related. But anyway, it's just a great place, and people here are just are wonderful, and that's why we're here.
Kathy wants to know about your rescuing people from the paddle boat that sunk in the river.
Well, yeah, I'll be writing about that in the memoir, this next memoir too. That was the Titanic, and it sank in the Tennessee River, I think around 83 or so. And I just happened to be down at the river and borrowed some scuba gear and went down and recovered the people that were in that. So that's what.
Wow. Well, I think Marcia and Kathy must be pals, because Kathy says that Marcia had a great teacher, and I don't know if Kathy was the teacher, but that's what it says. And then Marcia says she missed you last year in Beckley, that she was in DC for the day and had missed you. Tell me something. This morning we talked to college students, and we talked to about, let me see, 15 times 5, about 75 college freshmen. And we also talked to a physics class. And so when you look at the movie and when you read the book, people always talk about who supports you. What is your support system? Every child who seems to be to defy odds usually can point to one or two or three people, sometimes not parents, but there's always a somebody who kind of helps that child, gives that child encouragement. In the movie this last time, and as I say, I've probably seen the movie a dozen times, but this last time I really paid attention to, the messages you got from your father, and those of us who were, our parents were Depression children and World War II children. Our daddies, they weren't the touchy-feely type. My daddy had 5 girls, and if he ever changed a diaper, I don't know it. That's just not what daddies did. My daddy couldn't turn on the sink, I don't think. He just wasn't a helper. He was a good man, not saying that. He just wasn't a helper, B. And my mother worked. So, that was rough. But kind of looking at the relationship with your daddy, and did you ever, number one, think you might fail? And number two, who do you look to when you think, okay, how did I go from the coal mines to NASA? Would you talk about that a little bit? It was really inspiring. And I was looking at those freshmen, and it's hard to see, to identify from behind those masks.
Right.
But it's so interesting to see their little eyes crinkle up. And when you started talking about daddies and they're nodding, will you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I want to make it clear that my dad was my hero. I mean, really. And I learned more over the years how heroic he really was. But you're exactly right. The fathers that came out of the Depression and World War II were simply their job, the way they saw their job, as their father was, and probably their father's father was, to put a roof over the head of their family, to make sure that they were properly fed. And to do that required work, all the time. And you had to focus on that work. You had to keep that job. Once you had that job, you had to keep that job. And so what that meant in many, many cases, including mine, was that the father simply wasn't at home. And when they were home, they were exhausted from their job and couldn't pay a lot of attention, to the kids. And anyway, it was the mom's duty to raise the kids. That's what her job was. That was it. And of course, I had the kind of the extra situation where my father absolutely adored my older brother, who was a big football star. And my dad always wanted to play football, but he couldn't. He was a high school graduate, but he was not able to play football because he worked part-time in the coal mine, just during the Depression, just to exist. And so that was understandable looking back on it, but at the time, I didn't get that at all. But he was definitely my hero, and all the fathers in that era and still, of course, are heroic, and they should be always honored for those that stay at home and raise their kids, and of course now fathers get it a little bit better, not all of them, but most of them. So. Being a father is probably, unfortunately, I'm not a father. We're raising cats instead of kids, but certainly I've been around a lot of young people, principally because of writing this book and the movie, and it makes me really happy that they can use me as a role model. But what got me ultimately out of Colwood and on ultimately to be a NASA engineer, I think really, if you really want to peel that onion back, because I was a reader. I love to read. I was reading before I went to the first grade. My mom taught me. I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and I read a lot of science fiction. And it just, even though I was in this tiny little town, I traveled the world in my head. And so I was not afraid to leave Colwood because I felt that I already knew it from all the reading that I had done, and that's the way it worked out.
Kathy just says an interesting thing. She said both sides of her family are from the coal camps, and that the coal camp dads are awesome dads. They're proud and they love their children, but they just don't really say it.
Yeah, well, that's a West Virginia thing, and that's a country thing, I kind of think. Now they do. I mean, now they probably tell them too much they love them. So, but no, you never heard that out of your parents back then. Even your mom, you didn't hear that much, and that's not what they were there for. They were there to keep you alive and to make sure you were well fed and give you everything that you needed in order that you could raise yourself up and get yourself educated and get out of the house. So that was definitely a different time and place.
We have one question, Homer. Contrasted against newspaper and radio reports about the Cold War at the time, did serving in the military change the ways you think about and view our government?
Yes, absolutely. People ask me, what did you learn when you were in Vietnam, Homer? And I said, what I learned in Vietnam was that all those people in Washington, D.C. and all those geniuses from the Ivy League schools are not as smart as they think they are. That's what I learned, because we were over there because of them. And they didn't go, and we did. It was the country boys that went over and fought that war. And meanwhile, the scalawags that sent us over there were running away and then talking, slandering us. And, so yeah, it shook me. It shook me really to my core about trusting any government. But I'm a patriot. I love this country, and I'm glad I was able to serve, and certainly this is a great country. I think we don't get the leaders that we deserve, but maybe that's because we don't step up and we're willing to just, we work and we do our jobs and let other people get to be the leaders in the government that probably shouldn't. And so, certainly at this time, I never want to go into politics, but I'll just say that we have a great country because we have great people that live in it, even if we don't always get led very well.
You have an interesting question here from Milton, and this is kind of my question too. I'm glad you asked this, Milton. What he says is the fact that you were unable to meet your childhood hero, Werner von Braun, what impact, if any, did that have on your life? And then later, did you ever meet him? Did you ever work with him at all?
Well, the impact of von Braun on me and a lot of young people at that time was, I mean, it was just a story. Again, here's a story well told. The Russians launched Sputnik. Everybody was scared about that. President Eisenhower decided that nobody in the military could launch a satellite to catch up. We had to use a civilian rocket, and that rocket blew up on the pad and embarrassed us all over the world. And Dr. von Braun said, I can do it, and just let me do it. And so that narration, that story was told to us as kids, and we saw Dr. von Braun being a hero. He was saving us, and he did everything that he said that he was going to do. And the president, and then after Eisenhower, President Kennedy liked von Braun a lot and came and visited him, and we saw that story evolve too. Von Braun told Kennedy, I can build a rocket that will take us to the moon if you'll let me do it. And so Kennedy came on board with that. So again, that was the story that was told. It was a good story. And again, it's best stories are true, and this one is mostly true. So, but in terms of the fact that I never met him, that didn't really change the trajectory of my life very much. Once I got to Virginia Tech, I was just worried about getting through engineering school, and then Vietnam came along and everything. But when I did start to work with NASA, Dr. von Braun had passed away many years before that. I started in 1981, and I was 38 years old. So, I'm tenacious. I wanted to work for NASA, and I finally did when I was 38. And the Vietnam War slowed everything down. Apollo was canceled, and so it took a while for NASA to get back on its feet. And I was just happened to be there at the right time in the right place to get hired. And so I had a great career. I did meet a lot of the people who worked for Dr. von Braun, Conrad Dannenberg, Ernst Stuhlinger. They had retired by then, but I got to meet them principally from writing the book Rocket Boys and so on, and then being on the board at the Space and Rocket Center. Marguerite von Braun, the daughter of Werner, is a friend. She lives out in Idaho. She is a university professor, University of Idaho, and a sweet, sweet lady. So, so I guess, the fact that von Braun caused the Marshall Space Flight Center to be created, that's probably, and I worked for them, that's where the impact came in.
It is 6:10, and we have time for one more question. Or if we don't have another question, then what would you like to leave us with, Homer? It's been such a pleasure spending the day with you.
What I'd like to leave with you is read all my books. And hey, it's Christmas time, and my wife just yelled up and said, I have a little online store. And she does. It's on homerhickam.com, and you can order autograph books. I mean, I'm an author. That's what authors do. That's one of the things that when you write books, when you haven't been published yet, you think, I'm going to publish a book and it'll be instantly popular and they'll make a movie out of it and life will be good. Well, in fact, it's just starting after you've written a book and you get published. Then you have to start actually selling the blame thing. And so you have to learn how to speak, in front of groups and get out of your shell. And even though you've been in a shell for a long time writing the book. So yes, I think it would be wonderful if you supported the wife, homerhickam.com, and bought some of my autographed inscribed books for Christmas. And but otherwise, I just encourage everybody to read. Not just my stuff, but read. It almost doesn't matter what genre that you want to read in. It all just opens up our minds and get us thinking. And that's the sad thing about a lot of young writers is that they're not readers, and therefore I don't know how you could possibly ever write if you don't read a whole lot. And so I just like to leave, and I'd also like to leave it. I just had a lovely, lovely day today up in Giles County. I love it up there. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. I wish I had a herd of horses. I would have a reason for having a farm up there, I guess, but I don't. I'm with horses like I am with boats. I like to have friends who have, horses or boats, but I don't want to have myself a lot of trouble. But thank you for a beautiful, lovely day. And it's been great meeting everybody. And I hope that we can all stay in touch and
Tell us one more
as we
thing.
go forward.
With your next book, when will it be finished?
It's due on January the 15th. When will it actually be finished? I don't know. Linda, who reads my stuff, is laughing. But because I always panic her as I get closer to the deadline. She'll ask me what chapter I'm on. It's like, well, I'm still on chapter 1, but it's going to be really, really good. My guess is I'll probably actually finish it with edited version like March or April, maybe, and that it'll be out in time for next Christmas.
Well, you have wonderful comments in the chat of people thanking you for the information and how much they enjoyed listening to you. So we'll make sure you get to see these.
Oh, thank you.
Because they're very nice. They're wonderful. Cindy, my friend, what would you like to say?
I would just like to thank Homer for doing this with us. It has been very enjoyable, and I certainly enjoyed the book and the movie, and I will definitely be reading some more of your books.
Well, thank you, Cindy. That's very, very nice. It's great to meet you.
Thank you all very much. And Cindy and I, we were talking today, this is a great break. We can't go anywhere. We can't do anything. And we are going to try to do a couple of more of these just because it's a nice thing to do. So we'll let you know. And Homer, boy, you're just a delight. We could keep you around here for a long time. Cats, we'll get us some cats and some horses. So you'll come back and visit. All right. Good night, everybody.
Very enjoyable.
Thank you so much.